The flight was buzzing with the usual pre-departure chaos. Flight attendants giving instructions, passengers wrestling with overhead bins, and the low hum of conversations filling the cabin. Among the passengers was Andrew, a white man in his late 50s. He wore an expensive tailored suit, his demeanor exuding the confidence of someone accustomed to privilege. Andrew glanced at his ticket and walked down the aisle, his eyes scanning for seat 14B. Reaching his row, he stopped abruptly. In the seat next to his, 14A, sat a black man, casually dressed in a hoodie and jeans. The man, who looked to be in his early 40s, was reading a medical journal, seemingly oblivious to Andrew's presence. Andrew's eyes narrowed as a flicker of annoyance crossed his face. "Excuse me," Andrew said sharply to a passing flight attendant. "Is there another seat available?" The flight attendant paused, her polite smile faltering slightly. "I'm sorry, sir. The flight is fully booked. Please take your assigned seat so we can prepare for departure." Andrew sighed heavily, his displeasure evident as he reluctantly sat down in 14B. He made a show of positioning himself as far from the other man as the limited space allowed. The man next to him, who had briefly glanced up at Andrew's arrival, returned to his reading without a word. As the plane taxied for takeoff, Andrew leaned toward the flight attendant again. "I really don't think it's appropriate to seat me here," he muttered, gesturing discreetly toward his seatmate. The flight attendant's smile grew strained. "Sir, all passengers are treated equally. Please remain seated for takeoff," Andrew grumbled under his breath, turning his attention to his phone. His irritation was palpable, but his seatmate remained unbothered. Minutes into the flight, the captain announced turbulence ahead. The plane jolted, eliciting gasps from passengers. Andrew gripped the armrest tightly, his earlier bravado replaced by unease. "Not a fan of flying?" the black man asked calmly, breaking his silence. Andrew looked at him, his expression a mix of surprise and disdain. "I manage just fine, thank you," he replied curtly, turning away. The man didn't press further, simply returning to his journal. As the turbulence worsened, Andrew's discomfort grew. He wiped sweat from his brow and fidgeted in his seat, unable to hide his anxiety. "Deep breaths help," the man said after a particularly rough jolt. "In through your nose, out through your mouth." Andrew hesitated, then begrudgingly followed the advice. To his surprise, it helped. "You're a doctor or something?" he asked, his tone begrudgingly curious. "Something like that," the man replied with a faint smile, turning a page in his journal. Andrew let out a dry chuckle. "Figures. And let me guess, you think you're saving lives by telling people how to breathe?" The man didn't respond, his calm demeanor unwavering. As the turbulence subsided, the tension between the two men lingered. Andrew's earlier annoyance seemed to shift into reluctant curiosity. He found himself glancing at the man's journal, catching words like cardiology and surgical procedure. "You're really a doctor?" Andrew asked after a long silence. "Yes," the man replied simply, closing the journal and looking Andrew in the eye for the first time. His gaze was steady but not confrontational. Andrew nodded, seemingly unsure how to respond. Before he could say more, the captain's voice crackled over the intercom, announcing an emergency medical situation on board. "Is there a doctor on the plane?" the flight attendant called out urgently, walking down the aisle. The black man immediately raised his hand, unbuckling his seatbelt. "I'm a doctor," he said, standing up. Andrew watched, stunned, as the man calmly stepped into action, making his way toward a passenger several rows ahead who had collapsed. He could hear the man giving instructions with authority and composure, his presence instantly commanding respect. "That's Dr. Nolan," a nearby passenger whispered to Andrew, clearly impressed. "One of the best cardiologists in the country. He's saved countless lives." Andrew's face turned pale as the weight of his earlier behavior sank in. He sat in silence, watching as Dr. Nolan worked to stabilize the ill passenger. The doctor's expertise was evident in every move he made, his calm confidence a stark contrast to Andrew's earlier prejudice. As the flight attendants scurried to assist Dr. Nolan, Andrew sat frozen in his seat, his thoughts racing. The sight of the doctor saving a life just a few feet away contrasted sharply with Andrew's earlier dismissive behavior. He felt a pang of guilt but pushed it aside, telling himself he had no reason to feel that way. The cabin was eerily quiet except for the murmured instructions coming from Dr. Nolan. Passengers craned their necks to watch him, their faces a mix of concern and admiration. The sick passenger, an elderly man, had regained consciousness but looked pale and weak. "I need oxygen and any medical equipment you have on board," Dr. Nolan said firmly to a flight attendant. "Right away, doctor," she replied, hurrying toward the galley. As Dr. Nolan tended to the man, Andrew couldn't help but notice the respect and gratitude pouring from the other passengers. For the first time, he realized how wrong he'd been to judge someone based on appearance alone. Still, a small voice in his head resisted, unwilling to fully confront his prejudices. A jolt of turbulence interrupted Andrew's thoughts, and the fasten seatbelt sign blinked back on. Dr. Nolan glanced up, his brow furrowing. "Everyone, please stay seated," he said, his voice calm but commanding. "I'll handle this." Andrew felt his stomach churn, the unease he'd pushed down returning with a vengeance. The idea of someone he'd scorned being the hero of the moment gnawed at him. As the turbulence worsened, the elderly man's condition deteriorated. His breathing grew shallow, and his pulse weakened. Dr. Nolan's calm exterior didn't falter, but Andrew could see the urgency in his movements. "I need someone to hold this man steady," Dr. Nolan called out, glancing around the cabin. His gaze landed on Andrew. For a moment, Andrew froze, unsure whether to move. The eyes of nearby passengers were on him, silently urging him to step up. "Sir," Dr. Nolan said, his voice firm but devoid of anger. "I need your help. Please." Andrew swallowed hard, his palms sweating. With shaky hands, he unbuckled his seatbelt and stood, moving hesitantly toward the sick man. "What do I need to do?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Support his head and shoulders, gently," Dr. Nolan instructed. Andrew followed the instructions, his hands trembling as he positioned himself. The reality of the situation hit him like a freight train. This man's life was in their hands, and he, Andrew, had to trust the very person he had tried to avoid. The plane lurched again, throwing Andrew slightly off balance, but he held firm. Dr. Nolan worked quickly, administering oxygen and checking the man's vitals. "Stay with me," Dr. Nolan murmured to the elderly man. "We're almost there." Passengers watched the scene unfold in rapt silence. Andrew could feel their eyes on him, their judgment clear. As the turbulence subsided, the elderly man's breathing began to stabilize. Dr. Nolan let out a breath of relief, but continued monitoring him closely. "You did good," Dr. Nolan said quietly to Andrew, who was still holding the man. Andrew nodded, unable to find the words to respond. For the first time, he felt the weight of his earlier actions press down on him. Andrew felt the beads of sweat forming on his brow as he held the elderly man steady. The cabin was still tense, the atmosphere thick with uncertainty. He couldn't shake the feeling that every pair of eyes was on him, judging not only his actions now but his behavior from before. "Keep him propped up." "Yes, like that," Dr. Nolan instructed, his hands moving deftly to secure the oxygen mask in place. The doctor's calm under pressure was almost unnerving, especially compared to Andrew's shaky nerves. He had never felt so out of his depth. "Is he going to be okay?" Andrew asked, his voice trembling. Dr. Nolan didn't look up, focused entirely on the task at hand. "I can't make promises. He needs a hospital, and we're still hours from landing. Right now, we're doing everything we can." The flight attendants returned with a first aid kit and some supplies they had managed to find in the galley. Dr. Nolan gave them a quick nod of thanks and began administering a makeshift treatment. The passengers, though mostly silent, whispered amongst themselves. Words like hero and incredible floated in the air, and they were all directed at the doctor. Andrew's grip on the sick man tightened as the plane hit another pocket of turbulence. Dr. Nolan steadied himself against a nearby seat and glanced at Andrew. "You're doing fine," he said, almost as an afterthought, before returning to his work. The casual reassurance hit Andrew harder than he expected. He had been waiting for anger, for judgment, maybe even a scolding for his earlier behavior. Instead, he got nothing. Dr. Nolan's focus was entirely on saving the man's life, as if Andrew's prejudices were irrelevant. It made Andrew feel smaller than ever. The elderly man let out a faint groan, stirring slightly. His eyes fluttered open for a brief moment, and Dr. Nolan leaned closer, speaking softly to reassure him. "You're going to be okay. Just keep breathing." Andrew couldn't help but notice the relief in the man's weak expression as he focused on Dr. Nolan's face. It was clear he trusted the doctor implicitly. Andrew felt a sharp pang of guilt. How easily had he dismissed this man just an hour ago? But the moment of calm was short-lived. Dr. Nolan suddenly straightened, his face tense. "What is it?" Andrew asked, panic creeping into his voice. "His pulse is weakening again," Dr. Nolan said tersely. He turned to the flight attendants. "I need to know if there's a medical professional on the ground who can guide us. We need someone in communication now." One of the flight attendants nodded and hurried toward the cockpit, leaving the passengers in uneasy silence. The tension in the air was suffocating. Andrew's mind raced as he held the elderly man, trying to ignore the growing dread pooling in his stomach. Minutes felt like hours as the plane remained steady in the sky. Dr. Nolan's hands moved swiftly, his every action deliberate and precise. Despite his calm demeanor, Andrew could sense the urgency. "Is there anything else I can do?" Andrew asked, his voice breaking slightly. For the first time, he wanted to help, not out of obligation, but because he genuinely wanted to make a difference. Dr. Nolan glanced at him, his expression unreadable. Then he nodded. "Talk to him. Keep him calm. Sometimes that's all someone needs." Andrew hesitated, unsure of what to say. Finally, he took a deep breath and leaned closer to the elderly man. "You're in good hands," he said, his voice low but steady. "We're going to get you through this." The man's eyes fluttered open briefly, and Andrew saw a flicker of recognition. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep Andrew going. Meanwhile, the flight attendant returned, her face pale. "The ground team says we need to stabilize him for at least another 45 minutes. They've patched us through to an ER doctor." 45 minutes, Dr. Nolan murmured under his breath. He glanced at the oxygen mask, adjusting it slightly. "It's going to be close." Andrew's stomach churned at the thought. He looked around the cabin, taking in the worried faces of the passengers. For the first time, he realized how much faith they had in Dr. Nolan, and, indirectly, in him. The weight of that responsibility felt immense. As the plane surged forward, the stakes couldn't have felt higher. Dr. Nolan's every movement seemed to carry the fate of the elderly man, and Andrew couldn't shake the feeling that this moment was far bigger than anything he had ever experienced. Would they make it in time? Andrew could feel the sweat pooling on his palms as the minutes dragged by. The cabin was unbearably silent now, save for the hum of the engines and the occasional rustling of the oxygen mask or first aid supplies. Every passenger seemed frozen in their seats, watching the unfolding drama like their lives depended on it too. Dr. Nolan worked with laser focus, the strain on his face visible despite his calm demeanor. He was listening intently to instructions coming through a headset the flight attendant had given him. Andrew could only catch snippets of the conversation, words like stabilize, elevate, and emergency, but every word seemed loaded with urgency. "Andrew," Dr. Nolan said suddenly, snapping him out of his daze. "What?" Andrew asked, startled. "Hold his shoulders steady while I check his vitals again," the doctor instructed, already pulling out a small flashlight from the kit to check the man's pupils. Andrew did as he was told, trying to keep his hands from trembling. He could feel the man's weak pulse beneath his fingers, the fragility of life itself suddenly very real in his hands. "He's slipping," Dr. Nolan muttered under his breath, though his voice was still calm. He turned to the flight attendant. "I need more saline, if there's any on board. And make sure the captain knows to have paramedics waiting when we land." The flight attendant nodded and disappeared down the aisle. Andrew swallowed hard. "What happens if we can't stabilize him?" Andrew asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Dr. Nolan hesitated for just a moment before replying. "We don't think about that right now. Focus on what we can do." The answer wasn't comforting, but Andrew nodded anyway. He was struck by how composed Dr. Nolan remained under pressure. Even in the face of uncertainty, The man exuded a quiet confidence that was almost contagious. Almost. Another bout of turbulence rocked the plane, causing gasps to ripple through the cabin. The elderly man groaned softly, his body shifting involuntarily. Andrew tightened his grip to keep him steady. "Easy now," Dr. Nolan said, glancing at Andrew. "You're doing fine. Just keep him still." Andrew nodded, though his heart was racing. He glanced around the cabin again, catching the eyes of a few passengers. Some looked worried, others curious, but most seemed impressed by Dr. Nolan's calm leadership and Andrew's role in it. For a brief moment, he felt something he hadn't expected: pride. But that pride was quickly overshadowed by fear as the man's breathing grew more labored. Dr. Nolan leaned in closer, his movements becoming more urgent. "Stay with me," he murmured to the man, adjusting the oxygen mask again. "We're almost there." The seconds ticked by like hours. Andrew could feel his own breath quickening as the tension mounted. He wanted to ask if they were going to make it, but the look on Dr. Nolan's face stopped him. The doctor didn't need any distractions right now. Finally, the flight attendant returned with another bag of saline, which Dr. Nolan immediately hooked up to a makeshift four-line. The elderly man's breathing seemed to steady slightly, though his pallor remained alarming. "We've bought some time," Dr. Nolan said, exhaling deeply. He turned to Andrew, his eyes intense. "But he's not out of the woods yet. We need to keep him stable until we land." Andrew nodded, feeling the weight of the moment settle even heavier on his shoulders. He looked down at the man's frail face, the shallow rise and fall of his chest, and felt a surge of determination. Whatever it took, they were going to get him through this. The plane hit another jolt of turbulence, sending a collective gasp through the cabin. Andrew's grip tightened instinctively as the elderly man groaned softly. Dr. Nolan placed a steadying hand on his shoulder. "We're close now," he said, his voice low but firm. "Just a little longer." Andrew glanced at the clock above the aisle. 20 minutes to landing. It felt like an eternity. Would they make it in time? Or would the fight for this man's life come down to the wire? The captain's voice crackled over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've been given clearance for an expedited landing. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened. Emergency personnel will meet us upon arrival." A collective sigh of relief rippled through the cabin, but the tension remained thick. Andrew tightened his grip on the man's shoulders as the plane began its descent. Dr. Nolan remained calm, his hands moving deftly as he monitored the elderly man's pulse and oxygen levels. Andrew could see the sweat on the doctor's forehead, but his focus never wavered. The cabin shook slightly with turbulence, causing Andrew's heart to leap. He glanced at Dr. Nolan, whose jaw tightened. The man's breathing was still shallow, and every second felt like it could tip the balance. "Talk to him," Dr. Nolan said suddenly, glancing at Andrew. "Me?" Andrew asked, startled. "Yes. Keep his mind anchored. Even if he can't respond, hearing a voice can help." Andrew swallowed hard. He looked down at the man, whose eyes fluttered weakly beneath his lids. He hesitated, unsure of what to say, but then he started talking. "Hey, sir. You're doing great. We're almost there. Just hang in a little longer, okay? We've got you." The man didn't react, but Andrew kept going, his voice steady despite the anxiety clawing at his chest. "You're going to see your family again," he said. "They're probably waiting for you. You can't let them down. Not now. Not when you're so close." Dr. Nolan gave Andrew an approving nod but didn't say anything, his attention still locked on the patient. Andrew felt a strange sense of purpose as he continued speaking, pouring every ounce of hope he had into his words. He didn't know if the man could hear him, but he refused to give up. The plane jolted again, this time more violently. Gasps erupted from the passengers, and the elderly man let out a weak groan. Andrew's heart raced. "Easy," Dr. Nolan said, his voice low and soothing. "We're almost there." The descent seemed agonizingly slow. Andrew's mind raced with every possible worst-case scenario. What if they didn't make it? What if all of this effort was for nothing? But then he caught sight of Dr. Nolan's face, calm, resolute, unyielding. It was like a lifeline, pulling him back from the edge of panic. Finally, the flight attendant returned, crouching down beside them. "We're 5 minutes from landing," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "Paramedics are standing by." "Good," Dr. Nolan replied. "Let's keep him stable until we touch down." Andrew nodded, his grip steadying on the man's frail shoulders. He glanced around the cabin and noticed that every passenger was watching them, their faces a mix of worry and admiration. For the first time, Andrew felt like he was part of something bigger than himself, a collective effort to save a life. The landing gear deployed with a loud clunk, and the plane began its final descent. The cabin shook slightly, but the tension inside was unbearable. Andrew could feel every second dragging by, every heartbeat pounding in his ears. "Andrew," Dr. Nolan said, snapping him out of his thoughts, "you're doing great. Just a little longer." Andrew nodded, his throat tight with emotion. He looked down at the man, whose breathing was still shallow but steady. The plane's wheels hit the runway with a jarring thud, and a wave of relief swept through the cabin. The plane screeched to a halt on the tarmac, the smell of burning rubber filling the cabin. Andrew barely noticed the applause that erupted from the passengers. His focus remained on the frail man in front of him, whose life now hinged on every passing second. The captain's voice broke through the speakers. "Emergency personnel are boarding. Please remain seated and allow them to do their work." The cabin doors swung open, and a team of paramedics rushed in with a stretcher. They moved with precision, their faces stern and focused. One of them knelt next to Dr. Nolan, quickly assessing the situation. "What's his status?" the paramedic asked. "Pulse is weak, oxygen saturation is low, but he's stable for now," Dr. Nolan replied. "We'll need to run an EKG and start fluids immediately." The paramedic nodded and began setting up portable equipment while the others prepared to transfer the man to the stretcher. Andrew stepped back to make room, his hands shaking from the adrenaline. "Sir, you did a great job keeping him steady," one of the paramedics said, giving Andrew a quick nod. "That might have saved his life." Andrew tried to respond, but the lump in his throat made it impossible to speak. He simply nodded and watched as they worked. The elderly man was carefully lifted onto the stretcher, his frail body looking even smaller amidst the medical equipment. As they secured him, the team began moving toward the exit, their urgency palpable. Dr. Nolan turned to Andrew. "You coming?" "What?" Andrew asked, startled. "I need to ride with him to the hospital to ensure continuity of care," Dr. Nolan said. "You've been part of this from the start. You might as well see it through." Andrew hesitated. He wasn't sure why, but something about this moment felt bigger than him, like he was standing at a crossroads. Finally, he nodded. "Okay." The two of them followed the stretcher off the plane and into the blinding sunlight of the tarmac, where an ambulance waited with its doors open. The hum of airport activity buzzed around them, but it all felt distant, like background noise to the life-and-death drama unfolding in real time. Inside the ambulance, Andrew found himself pressed against the sidewall, trying to stay out of the way as the paramedics hooked the man up to monitors and IVs. Dr. Nolan gave instructions, his voice calm but commanding. It was clear that he wasn't just a good doctor. He was a leader, someone who thrived in chaos. As the ambulance sped toward the hospital, Andrew's mind raced. He kept thinking about the man's sudden collapse, the terror of those moments in the air. And then his thoughts turned to Dr. Nolan. This man, who he had judged so harshly, had proven himself to be not just competent but extraordinary. Andrew felt a pang of guilt, a knot forming in his stomach as he realized just how wrong he'd been. When they arrived at the hospital, the medical team was ready, whisking the patient away to the ER. Dr. Nolan didn't miss a beat, following them and barking out instructions. Andrew hesitated at the entrance, unsure if he should go in or leave. "Andrew," Dr. Nolan called over his shoulder. "You're coming with me." Andrew blinked, surprised by the invitation. He didn't think he had a role here anymore, but something in Dr. Nolan's tone left no room for argument. He followed, feeling out of place in the sterile hospital corridors, but unwilling to walk away. Inside the ER, a team of doctors and nurses worked to stabilize the man. Dr. Nolan stayed by his side, consulting with the attending physician and making sure every detail was addressed. Andrew watched from a corner, feeling like a spectator in a drama he didn't fully understand. Then Dr. Nolan turned to him. "You okay?" Andrew nodded. Yeah, I don't know what to do. You've already done enough, Dr. Nolan said. But if you want, you can stay here and wait for updates. It's up to you. Andrew hesitated, glancing at the man on the hospital bed. His chest rose and fell with the help of a ventilator, his face pale but peaceful. Andrew felt a strange connection to him, a sense of responsibility that he couldn't explain. I'll stay, Andrew said finally. Andrew sat in the waiting area of the hospital, the hum of fluorescent lights and the soft murmur of distant conversations filling the space. He tapped his foot nervously, unable to shake the weight of everything that had happened. It felt surreal, the flight, the collapse, and the moments when life hung by a thread. After what felt like hours, Dr. Nolan emerged from the ER, his expression calm but tired. Andrew stood immediately, his heart pounding. How is he? Andrew asked. Dr. Nolan offered a small smile. He's stable. We got to him in time. They're moving him to the ICU for observation, but he's going to be okay. A wave of relief washed over Andrew, and he exhaled deeply. Thank you, he said, his voice cracking. For everything. Dr. Nolan shook his head. You were there too, Andrew. You helped. Don't downplay that. Andrew hesitated, then blurted, Look, I owe you an apology. I was wrong about you, about everything. I judged you without knowing anything about you, and I'm sorry. Dr. Nolan studied Andrew for a moment before nodding. Apology accepted. But if there's one thing I've learned in life, it's that it's never too late to change your perspective. What matters is what you do moving forward. The two men shared a moment of understanding, the tension between them dissolving into something warmer, mutual respect. Days later, Andrew received an unexpected call from the hospital. The elderly man, whose name he learned was Mr. Hargrove, wanted to see him. Curious and somewhat nervous, Andrew made his way to the hospital. When he arrived, he found Mr. Hargrove sitting up in bed, a hint of color returning to his cheeks. Mr. Andrews, Hargrove said, his voice raspy but steady. I hear I owe you my life. Andrew waved him off. It was Dr. Nolan who did all the work. I was just there. Don't sell yourself short, Hargrove said. Sometimes being there is all it takes to make a difference. They talked for a while, and Andrew learned more about Hargrove, a retired teacher who had spent decades advocating for education in underserved communities. His wisdom and humility struck a chord with Andrew, who left the hospital feeling a deep sense of gratitude. Months later, Andrew found himself boarding another flight. As he walked down the aisle, he spotted a familiar face in the row ahead. Dr. Nolan was sitting by the window, engrossed in a book. Andrew hesitated for a moment before taking the seat next to him. Dr. Nolan looked up, surprised. Andrew smiled. Figured I'd sit next to the best doctor I know. You never know when someone might need saving. They both laughed, the tension of their first encounter now a distant memory. Throughout the flight, they talked, not just about the past but about the future. Andrew shared how the experience had changed him, how he now made an effort to challenge his biases and approach people with an open mind. Dr. Nolan, in turn, spoke about the importance of empathy and understanding. As the plane landed and they prepared to disembark, Dr. Nolan turned to Andrew. You know, it's funny how life works. Sometimes it takes a moment of crisis to remind us what really matters. Andrew nodded. Yeah, people matter. Moral of the story. This story teaches the importance of empathy, humility, and the courage to confront and overcome our biases. It reminds us that beneath the surface, we all share the same vulnerabilities, and kindness can bridge even the deepest divides.